My name's Letitia Del Fabro, and I'm the president of the Queensland Branch of the PHAA. I'd like to hand over to our PHAA Queensland Branch Committee member, Natasha Lee, to introduce Dr. Kerry Charlton. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, Letitia. Hello, everyone. Good evening from where you're from. As Letitia had mentioned, my name is Natasha Lee. I'm a Mwalgal Yidinji Kalali and Dungari descendant and a PHAA Queensland Branch Committee member. And I'm here today to introduce Gaja Kerry Charlton. Gaja Kerry Charlton is an elder and traditional owner from Yagara, Quandamooka, and neighbouring Gubbi Gubbi countries in Wallagamar in North Queensland from her great-grandmother. A devoted mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, Gaja Kerry is also an author and cultural custodian who works in social, cultural, and community development. Her leadership roles in community and government boards and committees include the State Indigenous Languages Policy Working Group, co-chair of the University of Queensland Reconciliation Action Plan Steering Committee, and the Indigenous advisory groups at all levels. I will now hand over to Gaja Kerry to give the Welcome to Country address.
I'm just putting 3 letters on a word there. Well, I'd like to say Numbly, Yungen, Yawa, Marumba Nunu. Friendly greetings, everyone, and good evening. My name is Gaja Kerry Charlton, and Gaja is a term that in our Yagara language, which refers or denotes to eldership. So I'd like to acknowledge everyone who's linking in from other parts of the country, the continent, whether I don't know if everyone is on Yagara country or from many countries. But certainly I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples of the lands from where people are linking in tonight. So we are, well, I am, and I think some of us are, if you're at UQ or at Griffith Uni or wherever, depending which campus, you would be on Yagara country. And Yagara country starts at the Great Dividing Range, southwest of where I'm actually sitting now at the moment, because I'm at Logan Central, and I'm very close to the neighbouring country, Yugambeh people. And so southwest is the Great Dividing Range, and that's sort of along there is our border with the Waka Waka people, and we then move east along the Logan River. Can you hear me? Sorry,
yes,
can you hear
well,
me?
very well.
Oh, did somebody call out and?
I think it was just a mute mishap.
Oh, okay. So we go east out, so along the Logan River and jumping at parts of the Logan River and passing the Githabul people, the Yugambeh people, we head out to what's now called Quandamooka or known as Quandamooka, which is the name of our native title claim over parts of Moreton Bay. And so we go out towards that area, and parts of that Quandamooka area are traditionally Yagara country. Originally, things of course are changing quite rapidly all the time, as we know in the world, and we go up, continue up the mainland to the Pine River. We pass the Brisbane River, that's our main river, one of our main waterways, and then we go up to the Pine Rivers, and that's our boundary, and then the next country is Gubbi Gubbi country. And I'm also a Gubbi Gubbi person. And then we turn west, and so we go bye-bye Gubbi Gubbi country, past Jinnabara country, and we meet back at the range just about around there, and to Waka country. So I've just named each of our neighbours, and we've been ancient neighbours for a long, long time, you know, over 70,000 years. I mean, some people say longer. I say a bit conservative, and but certainly we've got ancient neighbours, ancient connections, ancient relationships, and of course, Yugambeh meets Bunjalung, or shares shares that language, country, and group, and so we did used to have lots of traditional marriages down south as well, and of course we're still doing it today. And so we have Yugambeh people, and I have Waka Waka grandchildren, and a cousin brother has married a Bunjalung woman, so we pop down over Northern Rivers and check out each other's country and catch up. And so I just acknowledge each of those ancient neighbours. I'd also like to say I am also a descendant or a part of the Wollongama people of the Gulf country. And I had a great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother, who was brought down, forcibly removed from her lands up in North Queensland at the Gulf country around Norman River and Normanton, not too far away from Normanton actually, and was brought down here to Brisbane and married up, and many descendants. And so I like to always acknowledge my Wollongama roots. My tribe from the Yagara area is Jandaval, Jande for short, Jande or Jandaval, which is one of the tribes of Stradbroke Island, or Charangari, which is our traditional name of Stradbroke Island. And also we are Gurunpul people. And Gurunpul people is mainland Yagara, which goes from the Oxley Creek through to the mouth of the river. And then there's numerous other tribes and tribal districts across Yagara country. So, you know, we're living in an era where we've done a lot of work to find ourselves and each other, and also repatriating our knowledges and our systems and our culture and our country customs, sorry. So, but myself being Gurunpul and Jandaval, that's my East Yagara connection, and my great-grandfather was a man called Mukan, and Mukan married a West Yagara woman called Maminda, which means native daisy or flower. And so we have a strong connection to the West Yagara as well. And Mukan's mother was well, his mother, or his grandmother really, was a Gubby woman, and so who married a very significant man who was actually born, from his own words, he was born on the site where the GPO is in Queen Street in Brisbane. So of course it wasn't called Brisbane then. Some people call it Meanjin, Magunchin, but he certainly was a very important man who led his people to be able to survive some of the very excruciating, terrifying times that happened to our people. And by the time the Aboriginal Protection Act came in 1897, there were probably, out of the original maybe 10,000 Yagara people, there was under, about 200. So you don't have to wonder about what happened there. But my great-grandfather, I speak about him, Mukan, because he was a young man, and he had a very strong role as well. And one of his roles was message stick bearer. And so he would take the messages out to those countries that I named, and also the neighbouring countries. And so to do that, he had to have a good grasp of the languages that could get him across those countries. And and part of helping others that he may have met along the way who needed help finding country. And so because of him, we have a very strong tradition around the welcome to country. And so the welcome to country is something that's done when we have visitors to country or we visit somebody else's country, and we acknowledge that this is not country of ours, and we go and let the elders know what business we have, if it's okay to be on country at that point in time. And my great-grandfather was able to navigate much quicker because he was a message stick man. So the message stick was like a passport that took him through country. So he didn't have to go through all of the checks and balances that were in place in our cultural tribal systems. So I'd just like to share that that's what a welcome to country is about. And after all of the, I suppose, cultural bureaucracy, there would be a celebration and a formal acknowledgement of visitors to country. And they are part of our tangible and intangible cultural heritage, which we are strengthening all the time and repatriating. And so having said that, I would like to just thank you and acknowledge you for having a welcome to country at your event this evening. A little bit different to the one a couple of years ago when I spoke at the Cancer Council at the Fortitude Valley, but in Brisbane. But I'm sure it's going to be as interesting. I mean, I stayed for the whole shebang. I think I was one of the last to leave, so that's how good it was, and the presentation. So, which I you know, it's high quality. So I just want to thank you for that. And when in observing, that's an observation I'm making, is that with PHAA Queensland doing this and everybody listening and participating, it means we're all participating to that repatriation that I've spoke about in our ceremonial customs, and the legacy of those no longer with us as well, and in helping to inspire us and to build strength within our communities towards closing the gap and building that greater access and communities, opportunities that certainly we, as you know, we need more of. So I give honour to my Yuggurabal ancestors, the ancient custodians of Yagurrajara, and I have acknowledged our ancient neighbours, and I acknowledge my ancestors who cared for country for thousands and thousands of years, and I pay respects to elders past and present, and I send blessings to the upcoming elders that they may continue to stay strong and strengthen to be our tomorrow leaders. And I'd like to say Nariba Bing, Wunyal Waganyiba, Niba Ni Moramba, Niba Ni Nyambali, Dagais Nya Guris Beran. Bibalka Nyambali Yagurrajarana. Bibalka Nya Dagais Nya Guris, Nya Yagana, Yagana, Ya Yari, Nya Gindana, Nya Yagurrajarana. I'll just ask that our great Creator bless each of you as you work and as you talk and as you be together in this space on Yuggurra country. And may you all be blessed, protected, safe and welcome on Yuggurra country. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Natasha and Letitia, again for walking me towards it tonight too. Thank you. Bless you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kerry. it's wonderful to have you here, and I really thank you for those generous words.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
And you are welcome to stay, of course, but I understand if I know you've got busy commitments too.
I was going to listen in for a little while anyway.
Awesome.
I'll be quiet and mute myself.
So I'm just going to draw your attention to a few housekeeping things now. We have here some hashtags for the event you'll see on the screen. You can connect with us on Twitter. For the event tonight, we have a 10% discount on category A and B memberships for PHAA. You can find out information about PHAA memberships on that link there. There's an email address there for the Queensland branch, and also we'll be sharing that event feedback link later on in the chat. During the presentation today, we are recording. Unfortunately, we don't have capability for closed captions, but we'll provide a transcript at the end of this and probably share this recording as well. And just lastly, if you'd like to ask any questions along the way, please use the Q&A and we'll have some question time at the end. So the next speaker will be Taran Wiramanthri. Taran is the National President of the Public Health Association of Australia, and thank you for coming, Taran, and over to you.
Thank you, Letitia. A special hello to all the Queensland Branch Committee and also all members from Queensland. Thank you very much for that welcome to country, Dr Jack Elkington. I'm phoning in from Wajak Noongar land in Perth, but I feel like I'm with you there in Queensland. And just you describing the diversity of all of the nations in across Queensland just kind of made me think about strength in diversity, which is very much as well a feature of PHAA. So I've been lucky enough to be at the Preventive Health Conference in Perth this week. And it's the first time we've got together since the start of COVID. And it was a hybrid conference with about a couple of hundred people in Perth, plus lots of people phoning in, dialing in virtually. And it was a great success and really showed the energy we get from each other, how we can support each other, the unique organisation PHAA is. So the PHAA Canberra office came over and was the support crew, and there's a lot of hardworking people there, so really small nucleus, but then levering a huge volunteer membership of 1,800, 1,900 now across the country. So terrific organisation, a unique organisation, and really strong in policy and advocacy. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor Linda Selvey speak. She's the perfect speaker to speak about what's a crucial issue in Australia at the moment, which is the role of activism in public health. I picked up a PHAA press release that followed a budget, and it's talked about, you know, the disappointment and the underinvestment in public health despite fine words. And this wasn't from this week. Actually, it was a press release from some years ago. So it's a bit of a familiar story in public health. And I think PHAA has got a role to play in helping or pushing for people and for the people in charge to close the gap between fine words and fine actions, and between what the promises are and actual follow through in terms of funding, whether it's for public health workforce or for training or for climate action or whatever it is. So I think one thing I've learned recently following the climate health inquiry in WA is some of the best advocacy is not what you think needs to happen, but holding people to their own words. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Linda speak. And just to finally say that one thing we'd like to do over the next couple of years as a national board is be clearer about the role of the national office as well as branches and SIGs, and just so that we can all support each other a bit better and be clearer about what each of us do. And we really welcome strong branches such as in Queensland, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Letitia and committee more about how we support each other. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm really looking forward to hearing Linda talk today.
Thanks so much, Taran. So just to add on to that, the Queensland branch holds professional development events, and we advocate for ways to improve public health and to engage universities and other organisations in, advocating for the health of Queenslanders. So I really encourage you to join if you're not already members of the PHAA, and contribute to the branch. We're quite a welcoming team, so we'd love to have you on board. I just want to draw your attention to the Lucky Door Prize. It's a copy of, I don't know if you can see it here, Planetary Health. I don't know if you can see it. There you go. So if you complete the feedback survey, you will be eligible to go in the Lucky Door Prize draw for Planetary Health. Embedded in the survey is another link where you can anonymously, separate your details from your survey feedback, so that we can select your name out of a hat. Now, Paige Preston, the Queensland Branch Vice President, will provide an introduction to our Elkington Oration and our orator this year, Associate Professor Linda Selvey. Thanks, Paige.
Thanks, Letitia. So today it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to listen to the Associate Professor Linda Selvey deliver the 2021 Elkington Oration. Before I introduce Linda, who actually has also mentored me through PHA's mentoring program, I would just like to share with you the origins of today's event. So Dr. Jack Elkington was an Australian physician with a distinguished career in public health during the early part of the 20th century. He was born in Castlemaine in 1871 and enrolled in medicine at Melbourne University. And despite failing his final exams, he gained qualifications in medicine and surgery in Edinburgh and London. He then worked as a GP in Geelong before completing a diploma in public health at the University College London and a doctorate in medicine from Brussels. He was Chief Medical Officer in Victoria for 6 years before moving to Queensland in 1910 to take up the role of Commissioner for Public Health, during which time he helped frame the 1911 Health Act, Amendment Act, which substantially expanded the scope of the Health Act and extended its public health focus, which was really fantastic. He was also involved in responding to outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and also developed programs in areas such as sanitation, food hygiene, and child health. So the real core public health wins from many years ago. And then he was also involved following some of that fantastic work, when his and others' advocacy efforts to have a unified Commonwealth approach to quarantine was successful, he moved to the newly formed Commonwealth Office for Quarantine, first as Director for Queensland and subsequently for Northern Australia. He advocated a national focus on tropical Australia and the islands and territories to the north, raising concerns of the well-being of the people who lived there and the possibility of introduction of infectious diseases to Australia. After an illustrious career, he retired in 1928 at the early age of 57. Dr. Jack Elkington died in 1955, but a few years later, when a group of health professionals formed the Queensland Society of Health, the inaugural committee incorporated an oration to honour Elkington into its annual general meetings, and the first oration was delivered in 1958. The Elkington Oration has survived the Queensland Society of Health's incorporation with Australian and New Zealand Society for Epidemiology and Research in Community Health and the formation of the Public Health Association of Australia. And we aim to hold the oration every 2 years to honour the work of Elkington in public health. I would like to acknowledge in her absence as well tonight, Miss Alice Evans, CEO of True and granddaughter of Jack Elkington. In keeping with the spirit of Dr. Elkington, it's now my pleasure to honour the work of another distinguished leader in the field. So Linda is a public health physician and an associate professor with the School of Public Health at the University of Queensland. She worked in senior positions in Queensland Health for 13 years, including as Executive Director, Population Health Queensland. She has also worked as CEO of Greenpeace, Australia Pacific. She has been working as an academic for the past 9 years and has a particular interest in infectious disease research that informs practice, as well as the health impacts of climate change. She is a passionate environmentalist and activist, particularly relating to the climate crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Linda as she delivers today's Elkington Oration, entitled The Role of Activism in Public Health.
Thank you very much, Paige, for that lovely introduction, and a special thanks to Gaji Kerry for your wonderful welcome to country. It was so great to have the opportunity to learn more about the peoples, First Peoples of where I live and work. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am on Yagara country and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledging their ongoing contributions to Australian culture, as well as caring for country. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Indigenous Australians listening to this talk. And in the context of my talk this evening, I'd especially like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's activism for their rights to protect culture and lands in this vast place we know as Australia. And note that this started during the very first days of the invasion and continues to the present day, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to thank the organisers for inviting me to give this oration. It's a great honour. Although I do feel like I'd need to start with a disclosure, although this may not come as any surprise to people who know me, and that is that I'm an activist, and have no doubt that this identity will have an impact on my worldview and also on what I'm going to talk about this evening. Throughout my disparate career, I've maintained and developed my identity as an activist, which started during my undergraduate years in medical school and which has grown and strengthened over the years. In the early days, I naively believed that a reasoned argument and awareness would be sufficient to change policy and protect our natural heritage. But that soon changed. And when I first encountered activism, it gave me a sense of excitement and inspiration. It was so amazing to see people standing up for what they believed in, and I couldn't wait to be part of it. When demonstrating and participating in marches was still illegal in Queensland, I was out there, although not nearly as much as many other people who I know, some of whom ended up enduring some nasty encounters with their constabulary. But there was a whole range of issues to be involved in, a whole cornucopia, and when you're young, you just want to do everything, and I did the best I could. Oops. So at this point, I'd like to define advocacy, activism, and talk about how it relates to advocacy. As public health practitioners and academics, we regularly engage in advocacy, and in fact, I don't think we can do our jobs without doing it, given the need to change so many things to improve people's health. There are a number of different definitions of activism though, but the one that resonates most with me is one that was defined by Brian Martin in 2007, as cited in this wonderful book about health activism. And this definition is quite simple, and I quote, "Activism is action on behalf of a cause, action that goes beyond what is conventional and routine." In some countries, and indeed in Queensland in the 1970s and 1980s, simply attending a rally or a march was illegal and thus would have been considered to be activism. In the early 1980s, when I was still a medical student, I handed out leaflets in the city on a few occasions, promoting a rally in support of the Wet Tropics World Heritage nomination. I was stopped by police for handing out leaflets. And so then I put the leaflets in pockets on the back of placards that I put over my shoulders with a sign saying, "Please take one." But I was stopped again, and I'll never forget a police car screeching to a halt And after doing this U-turn and the policeman jumping out of the car to stop me as though he's confronting somebody robbing a bank. Finally, I resorted to making a cloth apron with a message and with pockets in which I placed the leaflets. And then when the police stopped me that time, which of course they did, I felt that I could convince them that I wasn't doing anything illegal. So in those days, even handing out leaflets would have been considered to be activism, even though now it's pretty hard to get very far in Brisbane without somebody offering you leaflets on a range of topics. As Laverick points out, activism can be both violent and non-violent. And there are many examples of violent activism, and sometimes this may be justified. However, I don't condone violence, and it is non-violent activism that I'd like to focus on today. Non-violence can be very powerful, and practicing non-violence is sometimes really important, particularly when opposing a force that is armed, because it means it's less likely that those arms will be used against you. But it's also important for winning hearts and minds, as people are more likely to engage with support actions that are non-violent. Movements based on non-violence emphasise the importance of training so that there's a shared understanding of what non-violence is, as well as learning about the range of tactics available to non-violent activists. Gene Sharp, who died in 2018, aged 90, was a political scientist who devoted a large part of his working life to studying and promoting non-violent action. Indeed, he spent 9 months in prison after opposing conscription during the Korean War. He founded the Albert Einstein Institution, so named because Albert Einstein supported different ways of opposing war and nuclear weapons. Albert Einstein also wrote the foreword to Gene Sharp's first book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. And a big focus of his work relates to opposing oppressive regimes. But their work is also relevant for other non-violent action, I believe. Gene Sharp documented the range of methods for non-violent action, now known as the 198 methods. This number is likely to grow as a consequence of the endless creativity that activists have. And some of these methods, particularly the methods classified as non-violent protest and persuasion, may not be considered to be activism in many countries where the right to freedom of speech and public association is the norm. However, it's worth noting that in many parts of the world, such tactics still bring the threat of arrests, violence and more. So now I've given an introduction, I'm going to switch tacks. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to describe a few examples of the rich history of public health activism. And then I'll speak to why public health activism is more important now than ever before. You might be surprised at the examples I use because they're not all directly aimed at public health. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about such things as bugger up in terms of opposing tobacco advertising, as I really want to focus on the activism that targets the broader social, economic, environmental and racist determinants of health. Because these are what we know to be the most important of all in terms of promoting good health. So I could talk for hours about the long history of activism led by Indigenous Australians, but I just want to focus on 2 examples, ones that have really inspired me. And firstly, the Wave Hill Station walkout by 200 Gurungji people, which began in 1966 and continued until 1975. So that's 9 years, when some of their land was given back to the Gurungji people. The pastoral industry in Australia prospers on stolen land and was built on the backs of Australian stockmen and domestic workers who worked hard simply for poor quality food, tobacco and clothing, and sometimes minimal wages. Many of you will know this story thanks to Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly, which, as sung by them, really highlights the resilience and patience of the Gurungji people who refused to continue to cooperate with being exploited on stolen land. And it's worth noting too that this resistance was on the back of enduring years of massacres, rape and having children stolen. But theirs was not a fight for wages, but a fight for self-determination, land rights and ending exploitation, all critical determinants of health. The next example is also one of patience and persistence, this time that of the Mara people. in order to protect their land and water from uranium mining at Jabiluka. Uranium mining began on Mirarr land in 1980 in the form of the Ranger mine. And in 1996, the Howard government progressed new uranium mines, commencing with Jabiluka. The activism against this mine involved many tactics, including such things as speaking tours, international engagement, a legal challenge, protests around Australia and around the world, student camps, and a blockade. And the campaign was led by the Mirarr people, particularly Yvonne Maragula and Jackie Latona, but also involved many other people and organisations. After stopping Jabiluka, the Mirarr people didn't sit back on their laurels. They then focused on stopping the Ranger mine, which became another success as it ceased operating in January this year. And now their focus is on ensuring that the land that was damaged by mining operations is rehabilitated. Again, land rights, caring for country and self-determination are key themes of this story. The health impacts of this win, and indeed the campaign itself, may not be that easy to measure directly, but I've no doubt that the empowerment arising from the campaign itself, as well as the outcome of the restoration of land rights and of the country, has and will provide major benefits to the health of the Mirarr people. These examples teach me about resilience, persistence, and patience. The story of the Mirarr people's fight to protect their lands involved both protection from mining as well as rehabilitation of the land. And none of these examples involves conceding defeat or backing down. As Cody McAvoy, one of the traditional owners of the land that the Adani Carmichael mine is situated on, said recently in a message to Adani, "Give up, just give up, stop. You either stop or I keep going, because I'm not going to stop anytime soon. There's no reason for me to stop. I'm going to continue with this, even if it's for the rest of the life of this mine. I'll be here and I'll be a thorn on your side." So I'm going to turn to another example now about the labour movement. And the Australian labour movement and labour movements throughout the world have made a huge positive impact on people's health through addressing a range of determinants of health, such as income inequality, safe work and working hours. It was only in researching this talk that I learned that the Australian labour movement actually began during the convict era, when as early as the late 1700s, convicts went on strike for better living and working conditions. And the labour movement then developed and grew over the years, really making a huge difference in terms of workplace health and safety and wages and many other working conditions that I believe has made an enormous contribution to the health of Australians. There are many examples of specific fights, but I just wanted to highlight one in particular, which is the fight for equal pay for women, which, as you know, still needs to continue today. But I came across this lovely example of Zelda DePrano, who in 1969 chained herself to the doors of the Commonwealth Bank in her lunch hour, before then going back to work. 10 days later, she and 2 others chained herself to the doors of the Arbitration Commission. I love the way that Zelda did this during her lunch break, and then went on to continue to work for low wages, but really paving the way for better wages and working conditions for women in this country. The onset of the HIV pandemic in the early 1980s accelerated the movement, which had been already underway, for gay and transgender rights in Australia and elsewhere. And this help was assisted by the evidence being really clear that gay law reform and gay rights were essential to underpin HIV prevention. This is an example of the movement in the United States. And some of the objectives of this movement in the United States in particular were law reform, access to clean injecting equipment, and also access to HIV treatment. As with many activist movements, this activism started and grew following frustrations about the lack of success of traditional measures. Larry Kramer, who was one of the leaders of the HIV rights movement in the United States, co-founded the Gay Men's Health Crisis Organisation in 1982. This organisation aimed to speed up scientific and government action on the crisis, but also help people directly who were affected by HIV to assist them in accessing treatment and support. This organisation used more conventional methods of advocacy, but frustrated by the slowness of this response, Larry Kramer and others founded ACT UP, an activist movement that took a much more radical approach to activism. Their tactics included demonstrations, blockades, and die-ins. They targeted individual politicians as well as respected organisations such as the Federal Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health. And even though there have been many improvements in the United States, ACT UP continues using a combination of activism and advocacy to improve the lives of people living with HIV infection in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So what is striking about ACT UP is that while it was sparked by a crisis, it reflected and responded to many years of discrimination, stigma and abuse targeted at gay and transgender people, not just in the United States, but worldwide, including in Australia. In spite of such successes, such as gay marriage, compared to two recent pandemics, the rapid response to COVID-19 with the rapid development of treatments and vaccines, which is a really good thing, in contrast with a much slower response to the HIV pandemic, even acknowledging the tremendous advance in medical science over the last 40 years. One might be able to imagine how different the response to the AIDS pandemic might have been if the impacts were felt by white mainstream society in rich countries. Advocacy by cyclists, which sometimes includes activism, is also something that improves the public health through improving cycling infrastructure and aiming to change legislation. This is not new, and I recall many of the critical mass rides in many major cities in Australia and elsewhere. And in the late 1980s, I, together with some other folk from the then Bicycle Institute of Queensland, rode our bicycles naked, except for a few strategically placed bandages and a helmet, of course, outside of the Labor Party National Convention at South Bank, not to protest about helmets per se, but rather to highlight that a helmet does not protect the rest of our bodies, and that there was a need for better cycling infrastructure rather than just trying to protect cyclists by requiring us to wear helmets. While cycling infrastructure continues to improve slowly in Australian cities, there has been a massive increase in cars and other road transport, and there are very large gaps. This makes commuting very dangerous indeed in many parts of Brisbane and other major centres. So it's no surprise then that cycling participation in Australia is declining, and that the male-female ratio is highly in the favour of male cyclists, which is generally thought to be a good indication of a general lack of safety for cyclists. The Space for Cycling is a wonderful group of advocacy group for cycling infrastructure in Brisbane. They run regular slow rides around Brisbane City on weekly evenings, including on these days, it's a Thursday evening, and is a non-violent action that slows down traffic and also highlights the range of people who ride bikes for fun and transport. Space for Cycling also organises large mass participation slow rides as well, and they have participated in activities that highlight dangerous cycling routes, such as the die-in shown here. This die-in involved about 50 of us, and we stopped cars travelling along Vulture Street in South Brisbane, a place where there had been a recent cyclist fatality, for about 20 minutes, probably causing less disruption than many traffic jams. The response to the die-in, however, even from other bicycle advocacy groups, was strong. Rather than joining the call for better cycling infrastructure, they condemned the die-in action itself. And this disappointing response really was, in my view, an own goal. We need to, even if we don't necessarily agree with a tactic, support the actions that people undertake trying to progress public health. And remember the message, which was about the need for better cycling infrastructure. The examples of activism that I've given so far, even ACT UP, although Activism for Health, have not prominently featured public health practitioners. They've been initiated by communities themselves, and as such carries the power and energy of people fighting for themselves. However, our current system is geared towards disempowering people through oppressive laws and overwork, and distracting us through comfort, sport, and overconsumption. As we all know, working hours for full-time workers in Australia is increasing. And on the other hand, we have a large segment of our working population who are underemployed, as well as a high unemployment rate. As you know, our unemployment benefits are so low that recipients are way below the poverty line. And in spite of this, and of growing income and wealth inequalities in Australia, and the omnipresent spectres of racism, homophobia, and sexism, many of us are quiet, apparently heeding our Prime Minister's sentiments that things are just not so bad here. So how do we encourage people to rise up and be quiet no more? Sometimes when encouraging others to participate in non-violent direct action or other forms of activism, people question whether such activism works and argue that maybe it's better to continue to push for policy reform through more traditional methods. A wonderful book called This Is an Uprising by Mark Engler and Paul Engler gives a range of examples about successful non-violent action around the world, as well as providing an analysis of and describing the keys to success. And it's become a bit of a Bible amongst activists. This book describes the inspiring example of Otpor in Serbia. Otpor rose out of mass protests against the Milosevic regime in Serbia in 1996. But prior to 1996, there had been a number of mass protests against Milosevic, but the protests had built and then died down again, and they failed to gain momentum. I may not need to point out what they were up against: a violent and oppressive regime where the instigators of these protests and some of the protesters themselves were arrested, interrogated, and punished. What was different about Otpor, though, was that they built a movement through building a network of so-called cells around Serbia. And this network was built on the principles of non-violence, civil disobedience. These cells grew around the country, and each cell did their own actions, using different tactics and demonstrating much creativity. They were always non-violent, but the actions just seemed to pop up in many parts of the country where they were least expected, and so they were also unpredictable in their tactics. This became inspiring to the general public, but also meant that the police didn't know what to expect, making it more difficult for them to stop the actions. The commitment to non-violence, though, was critical to their success. And the movement building was based on training in small groups, often in coffee shops and bars, with the training really focusing on the non-violence as well as some tactics. Members of the movement also built relationships with key institutions that supported the regime, such as the police and the army, and they even provided care packages to the army personnel at one stage. In the September 2000 Serbian election, the electorate overwhelmingly voted against Milosevic, who refused to stand down, but civil resistance made it impossible for Milosevic to retain and maintain power in spite of his efforts to discredit the election. As Engler and Engler acknowledge, Otpor did not overthrow Milosevic on their own. Political parties, the trade union movement, and civil society were also very important. However, they posit that the efforts to oust Milosevic would not have been successful without Otpor. Otpor was the instigator and catalyst for widespread popular support from the Serbian population through organising a rapid and broad-based rebellion. And this is a key point. Non-violent action and other forms of activism are important tactics in a campaign, but are not the campaign on its own. But what is special about Otpor in particular is that through this work, large numbers of people around the country were mobilised and remained engaged, so that the non-violent action was a critical part of the overall venture to overthrow Milosevic. So does non-violent activism work in countries without a dictatorship? Is more conventional advocacy effective in achieving change on its own? I don't think so. In a democracy, we need movements of people to gain momentum that will sway public opinion and therefore affect decision makers. And these movements need to be across geographical and class divides, or they can be discredited with labels implying elitism, such as people frequenting inner city bars or latte drinkers and Chardonnay sippers. It's important to note, though, that achieving this broad-based support is easier when the desired outcome is fairly straightforward, that doesn't require structural and economic change, with gay marriage as an example. The push for systemic change is more vulnerable to misinformation and the power of vested interests. Here the stakes are high, and major corporations and political donors have a lot to lose from systemic change and have a lot to invest in stopping it. I think that the key thing to opposing these vested interests is civil disobedience. Logic and evidence are clearly not enough. We need to refuse to cooperate with what is propping up the system that is causing the problem. Engels and Engels describe the importance of attacking so-called pillars of support that are the institutions inside and outside government that support the status quo. In the climate movement, some examples are banks and superannuation, engineering companies and transport and insurance companies. And these have been successfully targeted by activists in their efforts to undermine the fossil fuel industry. We've got good at attacking some of these pillars, but we haven't got to the heart of it yet. People, including many activists, are not sufficiently swayed or don't have the capacity to refuse to cooperate with and undermine the institutions, society and government that maintains the status quo of continued growth in emissions that are killing our planet. And unfortunately, this is the case throughout the world. Think back to some of the examples of civil resistance movements I've given so far. The Gringy people at so-called Wave Hill, ACT UP, the Labour movement and Otpor in Serbia. What do they have in common? They arose out of terrible circumstances that affected people's lives on a day-to-day basis. In Serbia, for example, Milosevic led a despotic regime that destroyed its opponents, waged war, destroyed the economy and local industries. Life just wasn't good for people living in Serbia if they weren't aligned with the political regime. Some might say that the regime would have toppled eventually, but achieving change still required a growing cadre of mass civil disobedience in sufficient numbers across the country to make a difference. Many of us have had enough of living in a world that's warming rapidly while emissions continue to rise, of reefs dying, of massive fires, heat waves and other extreme events, and of the threat of worse to come. Yet these feelings seem to come and go. They don't seem to be enough to result in a concerted push for change. Concern rises during and immediately after extreme events, but then the next thing, in this case COVID-19, takes its place in our consciousness and the climate crisis fades in our minds. Some colleagues and I did some intercept interviews with people living around Brisbane pre-COVID and asked them about their views on environmental issues. Some of these interviews were done during the beginnings of the 2019-20 bushfire crisis and when there were frequent mass protests about the climate crisis, thanks to Extinction Rebellion, School Strike for Climate and others. The culmination of these events raised the profile of the climate crisis and helped to bring into people's minds, and this was shown in our interviews, regardless of people's political persuasions. But in the words of one person we interviewed, they largely summed up the sentiment of many in saying, and I quote, "Generally speaking, I suppose everyone's concerned about climate change and the Great Barrier Reef, wildlife, all that kind of stuff. But to be completely honest, I think on a day-to-day basis, as just a member of the public and as part of a family, these things probably don't sort of enter our thoughts quite as much as it's probably more what we're doing day to day and how that's affecting everyone. And this participant was a well-educated woman in her 30s who voted for the Liberal Party in the last federal election. So how does the climate crisis become a day-to-day issue for the Australian people? For me and a number of other climate activists, it already is a day-to-day issue, and I think about the climate crisis every day and see the world through that lens. There's prominent climate scientists and others, for example, James Hansen, who is one of the world's most preeminent climate scientists, who's been arrested a number of times opposing fossil fuels, as well as representing his granddaughter and future generations in a lawsuit targeting the US government. He's been criticised for going beyond his science and not knowing what is politically possible. But that's the point. We have to go beyond what's politically possible. Farmers struggling with prolonged and severe droughts and people still recovering from massive bushfires or from floods are experiencing climate change as a day-to-day issue, but many of them still don't make the association between their plight and a warming climate. Extinction Rebellion is an example of civil resistance based on the OPCOR model of training people and allowing them to organise and resist in their own ways. They aim to cause enough disruption that people take notice and to escalate this until sufficient action is taken to prevent disastrous warming. Pre-COVID, when there's a lot of XR activity, they certainly succeeded in getting people talking, although they also probably generated a lot of hostility amongst the public as well as our government. Having said that, I look forward to a time when actions about climate are a daily occurrence throughout Australia. There's so much we can target: the fossil fuel industry, banks and companies that support fossil fuels, advertising that promote fossil fuel use, hyperconsumption, and so on. We could also harness our activism towards assisting people who've been affected by the climate crisis, but making it explicit about what we're doing. In an attempt to try and help people see the climate crisis as a day-to-day issue, I and a few other health practitioners founded Health on the Front Line. We participate in non-violent direct action targeting the fossil fuel industry, and I hope that our actions will not only cause some grief for the coal industry, they will highlight the breadth of concerns in relation to the climate crisis. We describe our actions as protecting health, not just protecting our climate. And I'm proud to say that a number of people from the UQ School of Public Health have participated in actions on behalf of the Health on the Front Line, including making the long and arduous journey to stop Adani's work on its Carmichael coal mine, if only for a short period. Here are a few other examples of our actions. It's difficult to get media coverage for actions that are in such remote areas. But after each of our 3 actions targeting Adani, we've attracted media attention because we are health workers. We are not the usual suspects, whatever that means. It's my hope that Health on the Front Line will continue to grow and flourish around the country, as there are plenty of targets where fossil fuel extraction continues to grow apace in Australia. So feel free to join us. For inspiration, I recommend a novel by the sci-fi author Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry for the Future. The book's narrative starts in the not too distant future in the 2030s. And some of the scenarios he paints are not pretty, but then they are plausible according to climate projections. His long novel also describes a huge range of activism that his characters undertake around the world. Some of this activism is violent, and some of it is about non-cooperation or civil resistance on a massive scale. In the novel, and realistically, the actions don't always win right away, but over time, they inspire more action involving more citizens. In his book, Robinson also envisages a complete overhaul of the economic system, and massive wealth becomes taxed for good. I found his book to be inspiring because it gives me a sense of hope in an otherwise less than hopeful world. It paints a vision of a better future that averts the worst of the climate crisis, but also addresses inequalities and exploitation. The book imagines a future and envisions a path to get there, one that's based on the capacity of people to rise up and resist, to be activists as well as parents, citizens, scientists, scholars, employees, and so on. People who see their connection to the health of our climate and to social justice as a day-to-day issue and recognise that they have to take a stand. It is an enormous privilege to work in public health. There are not many careers where we can affect many people's lives in such a positive way, and in which we can teach and inspire others to do the same. Our work saves lives and has an impact. We're at the radical end of the health spectrum and recognise how public policy impacts on health and often criticised as being partisan in the process. And I want to thank you all for what you do. But at the same time, we're at a point in history where what we do so well is insufficient to deal with the crises that humanity faces. As Albert Einstein so famously said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And yet we all do this, at least to some extent, unless we try and fundamentally change the system that drives the results we're experiencing. At the same time, we reap many benefits of this system. As middle-class people, we have access to more resource than humanity has ever had any time before. We have, pre-COVID at least, the ability to rapidly travel from one end of the earth to the other. We have the capacity to access almost anything that's ever been published. We can listen to amazing music, eat fish species that are facing extinction. We can drink the best wine, eat the best food, watch amazing films, renovate houses, drive nice cars, ride amazing bicycles, wear attractive clothes, and sleep in comfortable beds with the air conditioning on. This describes me too. It's not my intention to make you feel guilty, and I certainly don't want you to think that I'm any better, because I'm not. But I often ask this question to myself, and I ask the same of you. Do we really want to change the system that drives massive inequalities at domestic and international scales? Do we want to change the system that's driving our trajectory towards 3+ degrees of warming? And how willing are we to change ourselves and make us uncomfortable in order to achieve that? When I was young, I read the Diary of Anne Frank, as many of you also probably did. I also read as much as I could about the Holocaust, and since then I've been haunted with a question that some of you may share. The question is, if I was living in Germany at the time of the Holocaust, would I have resisted? Would I have risked my life, as many but not enough Gentiles did, in order to save even one Jew? Or would I have been one of the majority who chose to look away? I still don't know the answer to that question, and I struggle with it and hope I'll never have to be in a position where resisting means risking my life. But there's no time like the present. Inequalities are increasing. The world is warming more rapidly than at any time in its history, and we're facing the 6th mass extinction event right now. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and as we all know, this is bad for everybody. So I would like to finish with a challenge for all of us, including me. A challenge to strive for a vision for a better future and better health outcomes for ourselves and our children. Imagine a future of a more equitable world where people have equivalent opportunities regardless of where they were born, the colour of their skin, or who their parents were. A world that's rich in community and human connections. A world where we place life ahead of personal gain. A world where our natural ecosystems flourish and are protected, and where we don't face the threat of dangerous climate change. In this world, we'll have a lot less stuff, but what we have will be enough. And we will have pretty much the same access to resources as anyone else. A world where people don't suffer from chronic diseases, but live and age well. This is my vision. It's probably flawed, but many people would say that this kind of vision is the only way out of the mess that we humanity have created for ourselves. Talking about such a vision is not enough. We need to work towards it, recognising that the journey will involve a lot of people who share the vision but work towards it in different ways. We need to work towards this, even recognising that it may not happen in our lifetimes. So how do we do this? I don't have all the answers, but I do know that continuing to what we are doing now is not the answer. We have to do things differently, become more active. We need to strategise and build alliances across race, gender and class, and support the leadership of working class people and people affected by racism and follow their lead. And in our own ways, I think many of us need to become non-violent activists. Those who don't should support our activism, use their voices to amplify it, and do the other forms of advocacy and work required to achieve this vision. We need to resist and refuse to cooperate with the systems that are driving the outcomes we want to stop. We need to shock the system, undermine its pillars, build a movement, and create and then work towards a vision for a better world. Sounds like an adventure not to be missed? You bet. Thank you very much.
I'm just finding my video, Linda. Thank you so much, Linda. I don't know if we can all kind of turn on our microphones and give a little clap. Can we do that, please?
Thank you, Linda.
Linda.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda.
Downfall of not being in the same room, I think. We've gone a bit over time, but that's right. We've still got lots of people in the room. So I'm going to hand over to Brenna, who has a couple of questions. And if anyone's got any other questions, just pop them in that Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Letitia. Thank you so much, Linda, for your wonderful oration tonight. I was furiously tweeting away, so if you get into Twitter, you might see a lot of tags from the Queensland branch. So just a couple questions I have for you. Just on a personal level, what keeps your passion alive for activism?
I think it's other activists, actually, people who inspire me, and there are many such people in the climate movement. There's some amazing activists, but also the activists are behind some of those stories I gave. So I think they keep me going in terms of that inspiration.
Wonderful. And what has been your most memorable campaign?
Oh, probably the most recent. Now I'm getting old. So,
No.
I will mention the campaign to stop Adani. I guess not just in terms of the frontline action that's happening, on an ongoing basis, but just the way that it has mobilised people around Australia and around the world who are continuing to do activism and advocacy in their own ways. Even though the mine is unfortunately going ahead at this moment, none of us are going to stop. We'll follow Cody McAvoy and Adrian Burragubba and others lead in continuing to fight for that country.
Yeah, Marwa, she's really involved in that. She's one of my friends too. Speaking of other students, I have a question. As a current student of the MPH program at UQ, someone wants to know, how can students start their way into activism?
Cool. Well, they're very welcome to come and talk to me and others. But you could start by attending the school strike for climate on next Friday, May 21st, and the School of Public Health at UQ is sending a contingent that hopefully you know about. But also I think the important thing is to join a group that resonates with you, and building those relationships is really kind of key in terms of sustaining the activism, but also being stronger at it.
Lovely. And I also have another question. How can we assist people who are affected by climate change in their community?
Well, I think that there's a lot of examples that happened after the bushfires where other communities got behind communities affected by the bushfires and helped them in practical ways and also financial ways. But because we're kind of always a little coy about mentioning the climate word, often this was done without acknowledging a major contributor to the crisis. So I think doing it, providing that support in a way that doesn't detract from the suffering that people are experiencing, but acknowledging why, you know, one of the reasons why it's happening, I think, is where it can really become more powerful.
I just have one quick question that came through, and I just want to share this last one. It's a bit of a long one, so I'll read it out. Excellent talk. My concern is most of the non-violent activisms we saw are limited to a specific area or about the interests of some group, while some are global. As well, most of the acts that resulted in climate or environmental crisis are tied with national economy, to which the governments are not willing to give up. If there is a way you think could impose pressure globally in the face of the racing world, do you have a response to that question? I think they're talking about globally, how can we respond?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, what's the word? Think global, act local it really does bring to mind. You know, Australia, if we look at Australia as a global citizen around things like climate, for example, we're pretty poorly performing. So what we do here does make a big difference. And that's not only in terms of our emissions, but in terms of Australia's ability to sway other players on the global scale. I was limited to my 40 minutes, so I couldn't talk about all the other amazing examples, but the example, people targeting world trade and so on. So it's really, you know, the limits are our imagination really, and the interests and desire of people to participate. So if you have a particular institution in mind, I'd encourage you to join forces with others and figure out what to do about it. For example, I know there's Land Forces, this massive war weapons fair that's going to be in at South Bank in late May, early June. And there's a group of people targeting Land Forces as a way of trying to, you know, target that very important institution that's driving a lot of harm around the world.
Definitely many ways people can get involved. I said I had one last question, but turns out everyone is just so eager to hear from you, Linda. So the very last question for tonight's oration will be from Leonard Griffith, and he's asking, what do you see as the fundamental elements that enable vested interests to trump evidence?
Can you just ask that question again?
You know, I think I have to for myself, to be honest. What do you see as the fundamental elements that enable vested interests to trump evidence?
Oh, okay. Well, it's the power that the vested interests have in terms of their, it can be economic. For example, in Australia, the fossil fuel industry, you know, does reap economic benefits for Australia. But they also, the way that they affect power so much, and there's been quite a bit written about this in terms of the fossil fuel industry, but the tobacco industry did it as well. So through political donations, but also through being legitimate, important parts of the economy, through direct political influence and political donations and so on. So during the time of the introduction of the carbon tax, when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, there was more than one lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry roaming around Parliament House than the number of parliamentarians. So that, you know, shows that power of that vested interest that comes with having those resources, which is why we need to kind of mobilise the power of all of us to oppose it.
Yes, most definitely. Well, that's all of our questions for tonight. Thank you so much for your responses, Linda. I'll now turn back over to Letitia.
Thanks very much, Brenda, and thanks also, Linda. So I guess we'll just wrap up now, and a reminder with the evaluation or the feedback questionnaire. There's a link there in the chat box, and the lucky door prize, if you didn't see it, is a copy of this book, Planetary Health. So on behalf of the Queensland branch of the Public Health Association of Australia, I would really like to thank you, Linda, for delivering the 2021 Elkington Oration. And I'd also like to thank the organising committee, and to a special thanks to Taran and to Gaja Kerry Charlton for joining us this evening. And we look forward to meeting you all again in this public health space or activism space in the future. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so
No,
much,
thank
Linda.
you.
Great job, Linda.
Thank you.
Linda.
Bye-bye.